A staple of Americana is army men. Little plastic soldiers with all kinds of different weapons and in different poses, usually in the colors of green and tan. Given tabletop RPGs' roots in war games, I'm surprised there isn't more American games that capitalize on how easy it was to find these little guys. I mean, the idea carried over well enough for video games in the 90s and early 2000s. I fondly remember the game Army Men Sarge's Heroes for the Nintendo 64. Well, I heard about a D&D 5e clone that ran with this concept, so I figured I'd take a little look. But first, a disclaimer. I've done various writing and other freelance work for high-level games, the folks behind this game. As of writing this, in this May in the year of our Lord 2024, I don't currently have a working relationship with them. That said, let's get on with the review. Army Men weighs in at 169 pages. Nice. Much of it is rehashed text from the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition system resource document. So if you've played Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you're already familiar with the basics of Army Men, so I won't spend too much time on that. It runs on 1d20 plus modifiers, has advantage and disadvantage for rolls, skills, class features, etc., etc., though you should still take some time to at least skim through the different rules. It never hurts to have a reminder, and there are a few things that Army Men does differently from D&D 5e that are worth keeping in mind. Like, you don't have a race, class, or level, but instead you have a resin, a caste, and a rank. And also, there's no magic, and thus no arcana roll in Army Men. You're plastic soldiers whomst may or may not be toys played with by kids in their backyard. And that kid that was talking about having special wizard armor and was immune to all bullets is probably hated by all the other kids, and you know it, Marcus! But I digress. I'll be sure to point out where this game significantly differs from Dungeons & Dragons. The first thing that stood out to me about Army Men is the layout. The sort of thing I would expect is a long explanation of each step interspersed every so often with an example of what might look like in the real world. Army Men does not do this. The character creation section is 1 page long. One block of text is each individual step with a reference page. And the reference page takes you right to the section that tells you everything you need to know, concisely. The first step refers you to page 11, where the general concepts start, and one of the first concepts they cover is ability scores. This gives you all the information you need up front about how they work and caps off with how you choose them. Boom, you're done. You're ready to go back to the character creation section. All this in the span of about a page that is not too dense. And when you get back to character creation, the step about ability scores is just a paragraph with sparse details. And the effect here, if you read the example first, you get the general idea of what can be done, and you can flip back to get the specific details of how they came to that conclusion. If you started with the rules, you get all the mechanics laid bare before you, and in the example, you then see somebody piecing it together in short order. And all this, collectively, is done in less than 2 pages. I appreciate brevity like this. It's refreshing to see an American game have these traits that I love about Japanese games. This short form that doesn't go into excruciating detail repeats itself frequently. The resins are each a page long, giving you everything you need to know right then and there. Fill in the blanks yourself as needed. The layout isn't without flaws, however, since the demarcations of where one particular idea begins and another ends is not always obvious. This was most apparent in the cast section, specifically with each specialization a cast can take on. I had a little bit of trouble reading through the grunt cast initially, but I did eventually figure out what format they were going for, and was later able to apply that to other casts. It's consistent, at least. There is no magic, and no spells. Wizards don't exist in the world of Army Men. This actually cuts out a significant chunk of the page length compared to a fantasy game. D&D 5e spell list in the player's handbook is about 82 pages long. That is between a third or a fourth of the total page count of one book needed for D&D 5e. Exploits are feats from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but you gain them much more frequently, to the effect of capping out at 11 compared to the variable amount that you could get in D&D 5e. They also do not come at the cost of an ability score increase like they did in D&D. To compensate, though, exploits are typically a little bit weaker than their feat counterparts. Many exploits are a way to gain a new skill, and they also build off of one another, some being prerequisites for others, or they might otherwise give you one benefit in a narrow situation, as opposed to a whole host of things that you would get out of one feat in D&D. And the end result is that you have a lot more granular customization, but also a lot more to keep track of. While morale is not the version of it I saw in AD&D 2nd edition, I am happy to see that Army Men has a mechanic like this, something that measures how well a battle is going and can influence a character. It's still a little vague with only one major mechanic affecting it, and effects are mostly bonuses or penalties to certain dice rolls. But simply having a numeric scale measuring this goes a long way, I think. Gear, however, is the biggest departure from D&D 5e. Instead of giving buckets of gold pieces for a bunch of mundane equipment that may or may not do much in context of the game, Army Men takes a different route. It uses a point system to determine what gear you get at the start of a mission. You roll 1d20 and consult a chart. This determines how many points you get for equipment, and it's most likely to be 3 or 4 points. This is in addition to the standard issue gear that your character gets, which is their starting equipment from their cast, 2 magazines of ammunition for 1 weapon, or 20 rounds if it's a single-shot weapon. And if there's something you really want, the points you get can be pooled or shared among other player characters. Additionally, during a mission, you can make a persuasion roll to see if you can get an additional 4 points of equipment. A smart GM, however, will impose some realistic restrictions on this. If you're in the middle of a field and have no way of contacting command, there's no way the quartermaster can requisition a supply drop for you, no matter how smooth your silver tongue is. Also, pay close attention to the qualities of your weapons. There's a lot of granularity in the mechanics for these. The most noteworthy thing I noticed is that bonus actions are kind of the currency for getting some more powerful weapons ready, like machine guns and bolt-action rifles. Also, burst fire and full auto are surprisingly much more effective in Army Men compared to other RPGs that include firearms, like Shadowrun or World of Darkness. Each weapon category also feels very distinct, which is one thing I think is an improvement over D&D 5e, where your only consideration for weapons is, do I want to have 1d12 or 2d6 for my damage dice? Otherwise, you're getting a 1d8, or a 1d6. Additionally, a lot of the weapons have really colorful descriptions. Take this from the Game Master Aren't Old Man. While it only boasts a 5-round magazine, range masters who swear by this weapon will often say that it's more than enough to solve at least 5 of your problems. Gear is definitely one of the defining features of Army Men. And last, I'm going to take a moment to talk about one thing I typically ignore in role-playing games: the setting. And I made no exception for this in Army Men. I merely skimmed that section and only have a vague idea of how it works. Kind of. But that's one thing that the reader is constantly reminded of throughout the rulebook. The setting is more like a suggestion, and the moods, themes, and even the very premise of the game is up to the players to decide upon. That said, I will give you 2 major ideas that stuck out for me from when I did actually pay attention to the setting information. The default setting is something like the Cold War that went on from the 1950s to the 1990s. There was no open conflict between the major players, but there was lots of threats of it, as well as the global superpowers providing support to different sides in smaller conflicts. So, the setting is primed for intrigue and clandestine operations. But if you want a more clear-cut good versus bad setting, they also include enemies called the Vespoids, literally giant bugs that do not like the plastic soldiers. Though what I'd probably go for if I ran this, you're literally plastic men with guns. Ain't no reason the other toys can't take place in battles, and the bestiary in the back supports this idea, by including dinosaurs. Army Men is concise for the most part. It has all the information you need right there in a short book. I was skeptical at first since it's based on D&D 5e, but I was surprised at how it tweaks the formula. It uses a similar framework, but changes enough pieces to give you a different experience. Plus, the art spreads are pretty cool looking too. And it has reiterations of all the important information as appendices in the back, a touch I always love to see. The bad is that this is still D&D, and it's complete with all the foibles and praises thereof. You still have the linear probability of a 1d20, and you're still pretty well restricted to your classes. There's also a few places where the layout could be better since a lot of the exploits are a bit like skill trees, but there's no visual demarcation of how one exploit matches up to another. And when I was reading over the casts, I did have some trouble picking out where the options for the specializations began and ended. There's also no index, but those are a pain and a half to compile, so I'm willing to overlook it for an indie affair. As for whether it's worth it, I would say yes, especially if you want something new, but not straying too far from D&D. Army Men is a different enough game to offer a new experience, but it remains familiar enough that you won't feel completely lost while wading through it. It's D&D, with a few tweaks. Just be sure to read a little more carefully if you encounter some terms that don't make sense to you initially. And while the price tag might seem a little steep at $25 for a PDF, I'll reiterate that I've done some freelance work for high-level games before. They do their best to pay their staff generously. So the money you'll be paying for this is going to go into the pockets of the people they work with. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting or helpful, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to hear more about other unusual indie tabletop RPGs, check out some of my other videos, or consider subscribing. And remember, stay alert, stay alive.